Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, because we know people are joining us from different parts of the world. My name is Pradeep Nayak. I am representing the Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership, but I'm also based at the University of Waterloo in Canada. I'll be the facilitator and the host for the webinar today. So welcome, everyone. Before we start the talk, I'm going to do a few rounds of introduction. I will introduce the V2V Global Partnership first, and then I will also introduce our speaker today before we start listening to our speaker. So as an introduction to the V2V Global Partnership, which is a transdisciplinary research, knowledge, and action network with over 100 members from Africa, Asia, and internationally. The goal of the global partnership is to support small-scale fisheries in their transition from vulnerability to viability. And the way we understand and focus on vulnerability and viability is not just to emphasize the economic aspect of small-scale fisheries, but also to focus on the political, the cultural, the ecological, and all other aspects of the small-scale fisheries, as if it matters to the fishers and the fishing community. In doing so, our focus is on four objectives. One is to co-produce and co-create knowledge that is essential and effective for the transition from vulnerability to viability, create a repository or a database of the information and the data that is created, developing multifaceted capacity or transdisciplinary capacity that is helpful in working on the transitions from B2B. And then the fourth is synthesize and integrate the knowledge that is relevant for governance and practice, and also engage in activities of knowledge mobilization. The B2B Global Partnership aims to identify the diverse factors and conditions contributing to the vulnerability of small-scale fisheries in different parts of the world, and engage collaboratively with small-scale fisher communities and other key NGO, government, and university partners to enhance SSF viability. We're conducting transdisciplinary, community-engaged research in 6 countries of Asia. That includes Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, Thailand, and 6 countries in Africa. That includes Ghana, Malawi, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, and Tanzania. So that covers West Africa, East Africa, and South Africa. In doing so, the V2V Global Partnership brings people and organizations and institutions together across physical, cultural, and disciplinary boundaries through a shared interest in addressing global change impacts on small-scale fisheries. The thematic webinar, or V2V thematic webinar series, for which we have gathered here today virtually, is an initiative of the V2V Global Partnership to facilitate and generate high-level discussions on vulnerability and viability themes and topics and issues within the context of small-scale fisheries. The goal is to feature academics, government representatives, practitioners, and members of the civil society who have made significant contributions to the theoretical, practical, and policy aspects of small-scale fisheries, both locally and globally. V2V thematic webinar series takes place on the last Friday of every month. This month is not the regular one. And we are having the August V2V thematic webinar in the first week of September. That's a different date than the last Friday, but it takes place on the last Friday of every month, and it will continue to be so throughout 2024. The series is available internationally through live streaming on the YouTube. Details regarding the monthly webinar can be found on our website, which is www.v2vglobalpartnership.org. Today's webinar is the 8th in the series of V2V thematic webinars planned for the year 2024, and 44th since January 2021, when it all started. And it is my privilege today to introduce Dr. Deborah Prado as our distinguished speaker of today's webinar. Dr. Deborah Prado is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Waterloo, and she works with the V2V Global Partnership in that role. Her current research focuses on building a comprehensive overview of the primary conflicts and blue injustices affecting small-scale fisheries communities in Latin America. Through her work, Dr. Prado seeks to deepen understanding of how injustices exacerbate vulnerabilities and explores how transformational initiatives towards blue justice have the potential to successfully enhance the viability of small-scale fisheries. Dr. Prado's research is dedicated to environmental governance, particularly focusing on strengthening participatory and community-based management processes within marine and coastal areas. She actively engages in action-oriented research and has numerous experiences with transdisciplinary methodologies and co-production of knowledge among researchers, protected area managers, and small-scale fisheries communities. Recently, Dr. Prado completed investigation of a series of ocean conflicts that impact small-scale fisheries in Brazil as part of the Oceans-Pact Project, which was supported by the Belmont Forum, emphasizing approaches to conflict transformation. And we'll hear more about those things in her talk. So it is my honor to invite Dr. Deborah Prado to deliver today's talk for the V2V Thematic Webinar Series 2024 August. And the title of her talk will be Blue Injustices, Conflicts and Transformations in Small-Scale Fisheries of Latin America. Over to you, Dr. Prado.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prateep. I'm going to share my screen. Let me know if you can see it. Yeah. So thank you again for this kind introduction and also for the invitation to be part of the thematic webinar. Thank you for everyone that's joining us. So as Prateep mentioned, my talk's going to focus on conflicts, injustices, and transformations in Latin America. I divided this presentation in 3 parts. So I'm going to present some theoretical perspectives on conflict transformation, and then I'm going to bring this overview of blue injustices, conflicts, and responses of coastal small-scale fisheries in Latin America based on preliminary results of a systematic literature review that we've been doing this year as part of V2V. And finally, I hope to share more place-based research in Brazil that I've been doing in the last years on conflict transformation in small-scale fisheries. Okay. So an important milestone to situate this presentation is not new, but it's how blue economy initiatives that have the potential to intensify the conflicts in coastal and marine environments, right? As I said, this is not new. Different social movements and also the literature has pointing that in different case studies around the world, coastal communities and specifically small-scale fisher communities are being affected by encroachment of their fishing territories and also the degradation of ecosystem services in their different types of sectors, right? It's also not new that we already have a blue agenda that has been consolidated, right, in these recent years. And we have a lot of rhetoric on the blue. Yeah, the blue economy, the blue energy, blue carbon, blue revolution, blue investments, so on and so far. So it's in this context that the concept of blue justice has been emerged, right? And also blue injustice as a way to criticize and to contest all this blue agenda, especially since 2018. So it's a wake-up call, but also, as I said, a criticism of the possible emptying of meaning of all these terms. So in recent years, all of you probably realized that justice became a core element, right? That started to be in the forefront of this discussion. And there is the critique that investments in ocean sustainability must be done and in an inclusive and just manner. So this is a little bit of our starting point here, okay? And one of the things that I consider important to bring to this discussion is the way we conceive the conflicts. So the definition of conflicts matter, and the way we understand the role of conflicts matter. So when we are discussing transformative change, for example, or when we are discussing transitions from vulnerability to viability, we need to think more about how we deal with or how we can face the conflicts that are related to small-scale fisheries. And it's important to remember that a conflict exists when we recognize the opposing interests between social groups. So normally when we recognize these opposing interests, we can see some actions or reactions on both sides for the conflict to exist. So this is something important for us to differentiate when we have a problem and when we have a conflict, because we can recognize the antagonism, right? Or who are the antagonists in a conflict situation. Another important thing is that conflict is a processes, are processes, right? So normally it arises from existing relationships, and it has to do with the context, as we all that work with socio-ecological systems or complex issues know. So the context matters, and it normally reflects past interactions in the context that they occurred. So we can have different approaches to deal with conflicts, or to define or to conceive environmental conflicts or socio-environmental conflicts. And one of these approaches is the mainstream approach. Some authors consider it the mainstream approach, but it's also known as the resolution approach, that conceives the conflict as something bad that should be eliminated from management, right? Something that is counterproductive. So in this approach, it's common for us to see a lot of books on conflict resolution techniques. So we have a lot of techniques and tools to deal with this conflict, trying to find or optimize these processes or achieve consensus, right? So this is some of the resolution perspective. Another approach to deal with conflicts, or another perspective, is the transformative approach that considers the conflicts as something inevitable for society, right? It's a inevitable dimension of society. So they are not necessarily bad, but they can catalyze processes of change and transformation. Professor John Lederach developed this idea of conflict transformation in the field of peace building studies, and this is a booklet and an important reference in conflict transformation that was written in 2003. So long before of all this notion of transformation or transformative change that became a buzzword in sustainability science, for example. So of course, the conflicts create a stress in social relations, but according to this approach, they also have the potential to change and transforming these relationships into a more constructive, balanced, and just scenarios. Okay, so here is a table comparing some of the characteristics of resolution and transformation approaches. I just want to call attention that in conflict transformation, it's really important to engage with the complex and the underlying causes of conflicts through social, political action, through advocacy, through action research, and more. So of course, it's also important to mention that does not mean that certain conflicts in small-scale fisheries communities cannot accentuate some scenarios of environmental degradation, or that they can be socially, politically, or economically destructive. Okay, but the point here is that the absence of conflict does not mean that sustainability and equity are properly ensured, right? But these conflicts may have been ignored or suppressed over time. And of course, we also need to be careful with the risks in this contemporary transformative change discourse that Jessica Blythe and collaborators already alerted us, right? But yeah, the criticism of the conflict resolution approach is that sometimes we can deal with the structural problems of society in a very superficial way, right? Believing that with some tools and techniques, it's possible to really eliminate conflicts or find those presumed win-win solutions. Sometimes we can, of course, and it's great, but not always, right? Because in a conflict situation, sometimes we have much deeper, much historical issues. So depoliticizing conflicts and sometimes neglecting the power asymmetries is something that we need to be careful. Okay. So I finished this first part with the question why contestations are important and why make the conflicts evident is so relevant. The point here is that when we expose a conflict, we can have the chance to expose some inequalities, injustices, at the same time as we can trigger, right, process of social organization. So as you can see in these pictures, Brazilian small-scale fishers are saying no to shrimp trawling, or in Ecuador, they are contesting that the islands are not for sale, so they are trying to protect their territories. So when we highlight the contestations in place, we can alert the managers, alert decision makers, policymakers that some laws or some policies are not adequate or they have not been implemented as they should. So we can open up possibilities for challenging and modifying institutional arrangements so we can improve governance, right? Yeah, so I'm gonna move to the second part of this presentation, and I'm gonna bring an overview of the conflicts and transitions in small-scale fisheries communities in Latin America. This was based in a systematic literature review, as I said before, and it's a collaborative effort that has been carried out with many other researchers this year that are named here. So I'm sharing some preliminary results that has not been published yet, but I want to give you some of what we have found. So for those that don't know Latin America, I know a lot of V2V partners are from Africa and Asia, but I think we can share some of our realities in some sense. In Latin America, small-scale fisheries is very important and to be sustained and viable. We estimate more than 6 million of people depending on small-scale fisheries in Latin America. And of course, this is an underestimated number because we still have great informality and we lack fishing statistics in several of our countries. I would say that we have a high diversity, amazing diversity, not just biodiversity, but also cultural diversity. But Latin America is also marked by social inequality and the impacts of ocean development and the exclusion of small-scale fishers from decision-making is in different processes are increasing these conflicts, okay, conflicts and injustices. And into 2022, for you to have an idea, 37.5% of the population was affected by moderated or severe food insecurity. So, which makes small-scale fisheries very important in terms of food security as well. So in this work, we wanted to answer two questions. The first one is what types of injustices and or conflicts have affected the coastal small-scale fishing communities in Latin America? And then how initiatives that have sought to answer these situations or transform injustices and conflicts were able to trigger processes that enhanced viability of coastal small-scale fisheries in the region. So we did a systematic literature review in Scopus and Web of Science. We were following the PRISMA protocol. And we considered in this review studies published in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, which I consider important to mention because we have a lot of high quality non-English science being doing in Latin America. So it's important to also consider these in these more broader assessments. So we were looking for case studies research that were describing a clear conflict or that were reporting any type of injustices. And here you can see the map of all the 73 case studies that we found distributed in 10 different countries. So some of our preliminary results, these are the small-scale fisheries conflicts that we found. And you can see that blue economy is an important driver of pressure over small-scale fisheries territories with all its different sectors, large-scale aquaculture, ports, oil and gas, tourism, and so on and so far, followed by the conflicts among fishery sectors. Here, especially industrial fisheries is quite a driver of pressure to small-scale fisheries in Latin America. Then we have the conservation policies, related conflicts, such as MPAs and environmental regulations. And finally, the governance types of conflicts, okay? Of course, depending on the concept of blue economy we have, or depending on the initiatives of blue economy in each country, we could also consider industrial fisheries as part of blue economy as well. So we can increase the relevance of blue economy as a source of conflicts to small-scale fisheries. Here you can see the 4 different sources of conflicts distributed by the countries that we could get studies in this literature review. I would say that we can see that all these 4 different sources of conflicts are affecting pretty much all the countries that we have more sample of studies, even though we can call attention, for example, for the large-scale aquaculture and its impacts in Chile, especially because of the salmon industry. And I would call attention as well for the role of conservation policies in Brazil and how they are impacting and conflicting with small-scale fishing. And then we tried to codify the different types of injustices that we could find in all these papers and all these case studies. And for that, we used a typology that was built by TBTI project that brings at least 9 different types of injustices. So we did some adjustments in the definitions, but in general, we have the distributive injustices that are related to the restricted access to space and to resources. We have the social injustices that are those based on imbalance in power and relationship, for example, discriminating small-scale fishers, and it includes marginalization of women, human and indigenous rights abuse. We can have the economic injustices that are related to inequitable opportunities for growth, so unfair distribution of subsidized credit restriction, limited access to sea and land, and so on and so forth. And then we can have also the environmental injustices that are related to the disproportionate effects of pollution, environmental degradation, fisheries declines, climate change. We have the procedural injustices that are more related to how small-scale fishers participate in these decision-making arenas. So normally we can find some restricted access to decision-making or processes that are not considering the small-scale fisheries context when they are designed. We have the regulatory injustices when we have all those regulations that lead to an unfair competition for small-scale fishers, including quota allocation, how to control the use of gears, etc. And then we can also have the market injustices that are related to the limited access to trade and markets. We know that this happens a lot in some cases. So there are many types of market certification schemes that are not favoring small-scale fishers, and etc. Then we also have the infrastructure and well-being type of injustices when we exclude small-scale fishers communities from access to health, education, judicial services, safe drinking water, and etc. And finally, we also have the COVID-19 types of injustices when we can see the disproportionate effects of COVID-19 pandemic on small-scale fishing communities. So we were considering all these 9 types of injustices when we are codifying all these studies in Latin America, trying to bring quotes that could highlight when these case studies were presenting any type of injustices. So we could see that most of the injustices that we found over time in Latin America are related to distributive and social injustices. We have found at least 45% that related of some kind of injustices that are distributive or social, followed by regulatory, procedural, environmental, economic, market, well-being, and COVID-19, which calls our attention of the importance of us to discuss how to address these distributive injustices that are related to restricted access to space and resources in a blue growth scenario, right? So although we do have interesting models and governance arrangements, we still need to take more seriously how we are going to establish marine tenure rights or rights-based approach to small-scale fishers. It's not just about creating new exclusive areas, but really how we are going to implement them properly. And then our second question was related to the initiatives, right, that have sought to transform, or how, in this case, small-scale fishers were responding to these injustices and conflicts. And from those papers that presented some types of responses, we could find that most of them were presenting an active social mobilization as a strategy to answer to all these conflicts and injustices. And then some governance improvements, some fishing or tenure rights applications, participation in advisory boards, compensatory or mitigation measures, litigation, and finally, infrastructure and technology. So here are just some examples of what we are considering active social mobilization. We could see a lot of creation of grassroots organizations, a lot of protests, campaigns, or the strengthening or creation of some types of small-scale fisheries networks. We could see that in Brazil, Colombia, Chile, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Nicaragua. In terms of governance strategies or improvement, we could see some new regulatory frameworks emerging, some MPA's creation or requests, which is a trade-off because we know sometimes MPAs are also a source of conflict, but at sometimes MPAs could also help in terms of safeguard territory or conserving resources for small-scale fishers. And we could also see a fishery development plan to illustrate what type of governance strategies were going on and participatory management protocols. So as I said, in Latin America, we do have some fishing and tenure rights models. And for example, the commitment terms in Brazil, the fishing rights to women in different countries, the turfs and the marine coastal spaces of indigenous peoples in Chile, custodias in Ecuador. So all different governance arrangements that can somehow protect fishing territories. Then we were very interested to check what were the different actors involved in these different types of initiatives. And we can see here that the small-scale fishers and all their community-based organizations, fishers unions, were active. They have a lot of agents trying to respond to these injustices, situations, or these conflicts. So small-scale fishers were there. They are participating in all those different types of initiatives we found. And then we could also highlight the role of government. I would suspect that government here are represented by those local managers that are on the ground, that know the reality of small-scale fisheries, that are like experiencing also these conflicts. And also I would call attention to the role of us as scientists and universities, and probably we are, not probably, but I really suspect that we are doing a lot of co-production of knowledge as well in different countries of Latin America. So we have these questions to answer. Are these initiatives really triggering processes to enhance the viability of small-scale fisheries in Latin America? But I would say that so far this is a complex answer, right? Because first, not all studies are providing a more historical piece or a complete description of the conflict or injustice. So we have this time frame challenge. And as we know, all these processes are dynamic, they are multidimensional, so it's hard to establish any type of direct cause-effect relationship because of non-linearity. Yeah, but what I would finish the second part, I'd like to finish saying that the active social mobilization was very important and seems to be an important source of agency, of collective action, of learning, of empowerment, and a really important way to achieve rights to these small-scale fishing communities. And temporary and collaborators were also calling attention that there is a transformative power of resistance. And I would say that in these broad overview, we can find a lot of resistance from small-scale fishing communities, because these processes can drive conflict transformation into a more equitable, more just, and decolonial governance. We have a lot of colonialism legacy in Latin America, so this is very important as well. Yeah, so I'm now moving to the last part of this talk, and I hope you are not so tired. But after this theoretical approach on this broad overview, of conflicts and injustices in Latin America, I really wanted to finish with some insights from a place-based research that I've been doing in Brazil in recent years, and with collaboration of many other researchers. I would thank also Ivan Martins and the PI of this project, Professor Ronaldo Cristofoletti. And in this project that was called Oceans-Pact, Ocean Sustainability Pathways for Achieving Conflict Transformation, we were really interested in understand the conflicts involving the small-scale fishing activities and how could we work on conflict transformation. I was part of the Brazilian team in this Belmont Forum consortium. So we had this Brazilian case study, and I was part of this transdisciplinary team. We had different researchers from different disciplines, and we have very important non-academic actors in this project, especially the environmental officers of 3 different marine protected areas that we have in that region that we're working on, the marine environmental protection areas of the north, south of São Paulo, and other 3 civil society organizations such as Linha d'Água Institute, Confrem Brasil, that is a social movement, and Painel Mar. So in this case, we were working in the coastal zone of São Paulo state, as you can see in the map. So we have 3 different regions that we were working with in a more of 600 kilometers of coastline. They have their own particularities in these 3 regions, but in all these regions, we have small-scale fishing communities. And here you can see some pictures of these fishers. Most of them are caiçara, probably some of you know, but they are considered traditional communities according to Brazilian federal policy on traditional communities and peoples. I am not going into the methodology details, but it's important to give you some context of how we started to work with the conflicts. So we decided that we needed to have a participatory assessment of the conflicts, also to understand the demands of the research and to understand the most important conflicts for these different stakeholders in each of these regions, north, center, and south. So we did a long process assessing the conflicts that were affecting the small-scale fisheries in the São Paulo coast, including some participatory workshops, which was a very rich experience because we could prioritize the conflicts for each of the stakeholders, small-scale fishers, local governments, and other civil society organizations. And we could see that we had at least 12 different types of conflicts, like large-scale enterprises in coastal areas, conflicts among fishing sectors, as we saw in the literature review of Latin America, regulation issues, tourism, aquaculture, real estate speculation, pollution, and etc. But what we saw is that at that moment, legislation and enforcement was the most evident conflict for all the different stakeholders. So we decided to work with this conflict, right? This type of conflict, legislation and enforcement, which was related to a specific regulation of the surface gillnet fishing, which was a conflict related to marine conservation, but also related to how these state-led regulations are created and how the enforcement has been doing with small-scale fishers. And as you can see in these pictures, these are some protests of the small-scale fishers. So it was an evident conflict for fishers at that moment. And here, for example, in one of the signs, you can see that they are writing small surface gillnet fishing is not a crime, is a tradition. Or small scale fishing is asking for help. Please suspend normative instruction 166, 2007. That's the name of this regulation. So they were asking help and they were protesting because they had been punished because of this legislation. So just for you to understand more the context, in Brazil, we have a very extensive, a very complex regulatory framework of fisheries, which is very hard to understand, I would say, including for us. And there is a historic lack of communication, transparency in the elaboration of laws. We are getting better, but there is all this legacy of lack of communication and transparency that were impacting a lot the livelihoods of small-scale fishers. We also have a history of truculent approaches by the environmental police. So it's quite common to hear from small-scale fishers that they feel like criminals, that they are workers, but they feel like criminals. And this specific legislation in conflict that we started to work with started to be more evident since 2015-16, because at that moment, the marine enforcement capacity in São Paulo increased. So environmental police started to inspect more small-scale fishers and punish them based on one of those, this legislation. This legislation had two rules that impacted small-scale fishers. First, it was a legislation that sought to reduce bycatch. So that's why it's related to marine conservation. So it was created to prevent the bycatch of marine megafauna, but ended up making the small-scale fishing unviable. So first, the fishing should be pressed at depths greater than twice the height of the net. But according to fishers, it makes fishing unviable, right, in coastal areas, because it's where almost all the small-scale fishing effort is concentrated. And then another rule that was impacting them was that the upper part of the gear must be, but remember, this is a surface gear net. It must be at a minimum depth of 2 meters below the surface. But for fishers, it's impractical in operational terms and in terms of catching the target resources, because the target resources are on surface. So they were saying, we can't operationalize this fishing. We do this fishing for like decades, and now we just can't, because these rules are making small-scale fishing unviable and feasible. And according to our extensive document analysis, we did that to understand how this law was created, and we could not find any type of scientific evidence that it could really prevent any type of incidental catches. So we couldn't understand how this rule was created at first place. So we were interested in understanding how fishers responded to this conflict. And I would say that this conflict generated a series of reactions and mobilizations by the small-scale fishers, especially after 2019. And I will bring some examples. First, they started to participate in the MPA's advisory boards, their councils, and so they started to report this conflict to the MPA managers, and the MPA managers created a working group, right, to discuss the conflict, to bring all the stakeholders together. And besides, they did that. They brought together all the different sectors. They had some difficulty in reconciling the multiple interests, right? Then we could see that fishers showed this active social mobilization, so they did protests in different parts of the coast, as you could see in those pictures that I showed before. And these protests had a media coverage, and they were important to call attention of the governmental and officials, officers. Another important strategy from small-scale fishers is that they created the Sustainable Artisanal Fishers Forum, which was an alliance of more than 20 community-based organizations, associations, and fisher unions. And this new organization was also important because they were part of a legal strategy that the small-scale fishers also took. So they did a complaint and a pre-trial conciliation procedure. That's how we call it. So they complained to the public prosecutor officer, to the public defender's office. It's how we say in Brazil. And this complaint culminated after all, right? This strategy, the National Fisheries Department decided to suspend those rules that I mentioned before that were in conflict on a temporary basis. So they got a suspension of this law that was making small-scale fishing unfeasible. Of course, as nothing seems easy, even though this conflict had been going for a while, the government imposed some conditions to the fishers. So the first condition was that I say the National Fisheries Department would establish a technical scientific working group, right? That they would coordinate and that they would evaluate the impacts of this suspension and if they should be continued or should be extended. They would do that in 1 year later. And the second condition was that this decision-making should be based on fishing monitoring data, which the government itself didn't do, right? We do have a very interesting and long fishing monitoring in São Paulo state, but they don't bring any type of bycatch information, right? They collect other types of information. Any type of bycatch information was available at that moment. So what fishers did in front of these conditions? They decided to implement their self-monitoring of bycatch. Okay, they were funded by, they had a help of a researcher that was funded by that same NGO that funded a lawyer, the lawyer that helped with the legal strategy. So they had partners in this process, but I would say that they were they had a lot of protagonism in all this process of self-monitoring. And yeah, so they co-design and they build the monitoring protocol. You can see in these pictures that were some meetings of them when they were trying to build this monitoring protocol. Or in this other picture in the top, you can see some fishing leaders that were like disseminating some videos to engage other fishers in the process of collecting data, of doing their self-monitoring. And I would say that they did pretty well. They started to report data according to their local existing engagement tools. So for example, groups to face-to-face landing approach in all different parts of this coast. And in the end, they could report more than 400 fishing trips, and they could involve around 70 fishers in this process. In almost 90% of the fishing trips, there was no incidental catch, and from those, most of the animals were released from the net alive. So they had this knowledge and this information to bring to the table. In the middle of the process, our research team facilitated a participatory scenarios workshop. So we invited the most important actors in this conflict, including the National Fisheries Department. They attended our workshop. And here, beyond validating some of our research results, we could also identify the desired scenarios for the future of this conflict according to the different stakeholders. We had 17 participants at that moment. And we were asking them how could the conflict be transformed. I'm not going deep on this methodology and our results. We have more information on this paper that we published. But the importance here is that this workshop was considered by the different stakeholders and fishers a very important strategy, because especially the decision makers were there, right? The fisheries department, from those that don't know, the capital of Brazil is Brasilia, which is far from the region that we are talking about here. So they were in the ground, they could like understand better the reality when they could attend this workshop. Then, so yeah, some pictures of this workshop and how we tried to facilitate the discussion around this conflict. And then finally, we had the scientific technical working group going on. So the National Fisheries Department facilitated, like coordinated this group after 1 year of the suspension, and we had some interesting results for fishers here. The first one is that the fishers participated in this type of working groups. As you can see, the name is scientific technical, so normally just government and scientists will use it to participate. But at that moment, they were invited to have a chair, and some fishers representatives were there, and they could present their results, like their fisher self-monitoring data was presented. This data was considered to support the decision-making. So we had a counter-narrative with the conservationists that were part of the technical working group. And the outcome was the suspension of the law was extended until December 2025. So they got an extension of this law that had been suspended. Of course, this is an ongoing process. They are still working on self-monitoring to have more data to bring to the table in December 2025, or even maybe this year. We are not sure when the government is going to convoke, to call for another scientific technical group to discuss this conflict. So this is an ongoing process, but we had very interesting results. And I would bring some insights from that. So the first one, thinking about transitions towards justice and viability for small-scale fishers. In this case, the fishers were able to suspend this fishing regulation. Of course, it's an ongoing process, but they implement different types of mobilization strategies, and they had different types of partnerships for operationalizing the justice. They could use their resources and their source of power to change all these circumstances that were impacting them, and somehow counterbalancing this hegemonic narrative of marine conservation that's quite strong in the context of fishing in Brazil. So they could be there and they could experience sort of procedural justice. And I think another important aspect of this case is that fishers understood that the knowledge is a source of power, and their traditional ecological knowledge was used as evidence to pursue their legal strategies, to contest the conservationists, to support action, and in this case, to promote a policy change, right? So they could also experience a sort of epistemic justice when their knowledge started to be considered. Oops. Yeah. Another important thing that I would mention is the relevance of this self-monitoring of bycatch process, because it started to be what I would say a transformative knowledge network, right? They started to give visibility to what was previously made to be invisible when they were not consulted about this law creation, right? And they could legitimacy to their traditional knowledge in this process. Of course, we already know partnerships are very important, yes, but I would call attention for that we need to qualify all these partnerships that are working with the communities, right? And I would say that in this case, they were emancipatory partnerships. So they were giving voice and protagonism to the fishers when they built their self-monitoring of bycatch, for example. And I would call attention as well for the local managers' profile, especially the marine protected area managers and those officers that were in that moment in the fisheries department, because they had values, they had worldviews that could be sensitive to small-scale fishers at that moment, which is not always, right? We don't have it always. So this is something from this particular context that's important to be also raised, highlighted. And as we could see in the Latin America, like assessment, and here in this case in Brazil, small-scale fishers are not just passive victims of domination or those top-down transformations or transitions, but they are really, or they can be really active agents of all these changes. And I think this is the most important aspect that I would highlight in this talk today. Of course, conflicts are dependent on their historical context, on their social conditions. We are talking about gender issues, right? A lot of other power relations or power asymmetries that are in place when we are talking about these conflicts. But when we deal with these different aspects, when we really engage with all these historical contexts, we can understand power asymmetries and promote and look for how to transform some underlying causes of conflicts. At least in Latin America, we could see that we have countless sectors that conflict with small-scale fishing, including blue economy, those conflicts that happen among the fishing sectors, the conservation issues and governance issues also in conflict. And I would call attention for the distributive and social injustices that were the most found in the literature over time. The structural, relational, and power resources are needed to transform the conflicts, as I said before, if you were looking for just and sustainable scenarios. We are talking in terms of resources, we are talking about time, we are talking about economic resources, we are talking about knowledge, right? As we saw in the case of Brazil. And all these tools or these conditions, structural, relational, and power conditions, are decisive to expose all these inequalities and injustices, and they are very important to trigger the processes of mobilization and social organization that we saw are very powerful and transformative to reach the viability of the small-scale fishers. So I finish here. I think I'm on my time, not sure. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will be happy to listen comments and answers and all questions you may have. Thank you.
It is wonderful. Thank you very much, Deborah. This wonderful, compilation of the synthesis work that you are doing, but also kind of, adding to the rich analysis, a case study from Brazil, which shows the multidimensional nature of, conflict and justice relationships, but also a nice segue into, how viability can be achieved or not in the small-scale fisheries sector through focusing on injustice and justice issues. That is wonderful. Thank you very much. At this point, we have some time for questions. Viewers on YouTube, please write your questions so that we can read it out to our speaker today. But in the meantime, I have a question from Dr. Derek Armitage from University of Waterloo. And Derek is saying, thank you, Deborah, for a really nice overview of ideas around conflicts and transformations, and for offering a more global perspective as well as place-based insights. You have drawn attention to social mobilization that emerge from conflict, but then serve as a key strategy to enhance viability of small-scale fisheries. Are there one or two examples of social mobilization that really come to mind that have been more durable through time and led to social and ecological outcomes? That's one question. And I appreciate you have made it very clear that drawing links between mobilization activities and outcomes is really difficult and complex. But I'm curious about some examples that can be explored further.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Derek, for the question. I mean, we do have other examples beyond this case. I'm not sure if this is what Derek is mentioning. Beyond this case in Brazil, I can say about Brazil. And one of those I would mention is the role of some social movements of small-scale fishers that we have in Brazil. We have the national movements of small-scale fishermen and fisherwomen, for example, that are very active in doing campaigns, for example, to protect fishing territories and to be in the capital, like doing advocacy to bring some new laws on that could help or protect more small-scale fishers. So they are doing that, and they are having some achievements. So, for example, they are now working on a specific law of the sea that we don't have in Brazil yet. And in this case, all these traditional communities, such as small-scale fishers on the coast, could be, for example, protected, and they need to be consulted about any type of project that are coming into their territory. So this is something important. And I would add, in terms of this type of prior consultation, I don't know if this is a familiar for everybody, I think yes. So in the coast of São Paulo, for example, they started to build a new protocol for all these type of, including research projects and all these projects of different types of enterprises in their territory. So they need to be consulted prior to any type of new project that is coming to their territory. So I think in this case is something really relevant for them in terms of active social mobilization to make sure that all these new activities are not harming them again, or that can not promote environmental degradation. So we have a lot of examples of small-scale fisher groups participating in these environmental licensing processes, questioning with the help of other researchers or partners, questioning how these new projects or blue economy projects are not damaging their environment, for example. So I'd say that they are having a lot of positive outcomes. Not that this is the best scenario, but I think we can find a lot of learnings of all this process of social mobilization.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the answer, response to that. I don't see any questions yet, but I have one question for you. In the initial part of the presentation, you talked about, 4 factors that trigger, injustices in the synthesis work that you're doing, and they are blue economy and conservation policies, governance, and conflicts in the sector itself. Most of these seem to be externally driven or external drivers, but did you have any examples of more systemic or historical, deep-rooted factors that could trigger injustice within these communities itself? Other than these 4, of course, conflicts could be systemic in nature. But other than that, are there factors that you encountered in your synthesis and analysis?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Thank you, Pratib. I think more than all these external drivings, we have some systemic issues to deal with in terms of all these small-scale fishing communities that are related to how they are marginalized. They are now we are getting better, but I think we still have a lot to do in terms of how we really make these participatory processes fair, like really participatory, because we can see a lot of calls and open space to them to be part, but we still have a lot to work on these power asymmetries, including in our transdisciplinary projects as well, like how we, as researchers, are reinforcing all these power asymmetries, I would say. So in terms of systemic or structural issues, I think they can't attend a meeting because they are stopping working sometimes. So how can we support fishers to really be in a more symmetrical participation in all this process? If I'm considering that social mobilization and all these active strategies are important, they need to be able to be there. So I have some interesting quotes from other experiences I had with these communities that are related to, I don't have money to go to the meeting. I can't pay my transportation to go there. So how am I going to be able to change things? And this was a leadership, like someone that really needed to be there. So I think these are some interesting questions, including for our research agencies. How can we support them to be part of all these projects? Because are we gonna pay their day off work, for example, or we can't? We have problems to do that with our agents, for example.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and that probably speaks to the point that these systemic issues are kind of overlapping in nature, because they run through these four factors, the governance, and then the conflicts and blue economy and all of that. These external drivers are imposed without consideration of the ongoing injustices or ongoing systemic issues in place in the communities, and that complicates things further from the perspective of justice and justice. So but also your use of the typology, the 9 different types of injustice. You reference it to TBTI probably, and it gives an understanding that some of them are overlapping. So you have the procedural, you have the distributive, and those are very straightforward categories. But then social, economic, environmental, and those kind of things. So they are not distinct categories. So the typology is a bit the different categories overlap into each other. So, and my understanding is that it could be a bit confusing at times, because most social, economic, and environmental injustices could be procedural, distributive in nature. And so my question then is, in your work, are you trying to stay with this typology, or you are going to come up with or suggestions for a new typology based on your work?
Wow, this is another good question, and something that we needed to deal in terms of methodological challenges when we are doing a systematic literature review. So when I consider this typology was because we could have some definitions, and as we already know that they could overlap, we were able to codify all these quotes that we found as different types of injustices. And not just one, we could pick a lot of them.
Yeah.
As soon as we had quotes that could highlight and illustrate the injustice, we could use more than one or codify more, classify more than one. So this was our strategy, methodological strategy in terms of how we could like capture all these different injustices when we don't know the context, we are just reading the paper. So that's why we chose this more, like I'd say, broad way to conceive injustices, but I'm sure that they overlap. So I would say that maybe we can have at least 3 of those injustices in each of those case studies, medium. So we were like considering more than one. It was not just one. So this is something important as a way to deal with this challenge. But if we are going to build another one, I think we could do that for sure. We did some adjustments in the way the typology was originally created to bring it more like concise but simple, but also like how would be helpful for us that were codifying the papers, me, Naya, Rocio, and Trills. So yeah, we already have changed it a little bit, the typology, but I'm sure we could do it better and bring another one that could be simpler, or we could have less categories and somehow, I don't know.
I mean, that could be a novel contribution of your interesting work that you are doing, because I see that there is probably a potential to do a kind of a, relational map to see, where are the distributional issues mostly, positioned, so you might find that in economic justice domain or social justice domain, there is more distributive, justice issues or something. I'm just conjecturing here, but it could be a really nice, Venn diagram or relational diagram to show that where are the issues, where are the distributional issues mostly concentrated, or where are the procedural issues mostly concentrated. It may not be in the governance sector or something like that. So probably it will lead to new areas of findings in the topic that you are dealing with. I know that we are almost at time, but what I'm going to do is I have one more question from Derek. I'm going to read that question to you, and then with your answer, we'll bring it to an end. Okay. And Derek's question is: the Brazil case was interesting, not least of which was how a regulation could be designed in such a top-down way that was so impractical for SSF. But I'm interested in the role of leadership in this case. Do you know if there were specific individuals or organizations that catalyzed the strategies, like the forum? More broadly, I'm curious if there were specific strategies or leverage points that led to this conflict being addressed. For example, was it the building of the social network, or was it the co-design process? What came first?
Thanks, Derek. Very interesting. First, Pratip, I really liked your suggestions. We can work on that for sure in terms of how we can bring another typology. The leaderships were very important, the leaders. So we were working with them. So we had what we call like the focal points, because we have some other leaderships that are working with other agendas in this region, but we had the focal points of North, Center, and South. So those are the representatives that were the most important leaderships in this forum that I said. So they were there when they created this forum as a strategy to put everybody together, and all these community-based associations, fishery unions that was spread along all this coastline. So they were really important because they were there, and then they were invited to be part of this scientific technical group. So they are the voices of, so we have like 2 at least in each of these 3 regions, South, Center, and South and North, sorry. So yeah, I think they were really, really important in this case. And I would say that there are many other things in the past that helped that this conflict could be addressed in the way I explained it. One of the things that I would say is that before this legislation, small-scale fisheries in São Paulo coast were able to change another one, but with a different participation. than this. In that case, they were for a while they were prohibited to use any type of motorboats in the first nautical mile. So it was like something that turned totally unviable the small-scale fisheries. So they were able to change this legislation with the help of all these MPA managers that I mentioned before. So the MPAs were working together with them, and they were like doing some technical reports and all of those information needed to change this legislation. But in the second conflict, this one that I was presenting, the information was from the fishers. So I can see some change. At that moment, they could see that, okay, if we do have this type of reports, this type of knowledge systematization or something like that, we can argue and we can try to change our reality. But now we want to have our own information. Yeah. So we had a lot of, I think, changes in the one from the other, but that other process was really important as a learning process to fishers. So I would say that. I don't know if I have much time to mention others, but this is something that I would say that is important in terms of...
That's great. I know we are at time, but I have a question from Patrick McHoney. And hi, Patrick. And I would just read it if you can have a brief response to that. Patrick is asking, are there significant socio-cultural, legal, institutional differences between the North and the Northeast regions versus South and Southeast regions of Brazil that constrain a national approach to blue justice for SSF?
Hi, Patrick. Thank you for your question. Long time I don't see you. Yeah, Patrick, for sure. We are so big, so we have a lot of difference in terms of cultural aspects of small-scale fishers. I'm pretty sure you know all this region because you've been working there. But in terms of São Paulo coast, I would say that comparing with the northeast coast of Brazil, we have less than this political... We are starting now, but in the Northeast, for example, the church was really important in terms of how the social organization of small-scale fishers took place. Because of all these, I forgot the name, but the church and in 60s, they have this political liberation theology, that's the name, liberation theology, and a lot of role in church in organizing the communities politically included, politically. But in the southeast part of Brazil, that was not the same. So I would say that they are starting now to get more politicized and organized than if we compare. So this is something that is cultural, is different. And from the south is totally different as well. Yeah, but I think in this part of Brazil, the São Paulo coast, we are now getting more and more organized with the help of some important partnerships. You would call attention for an NGO that work with us, that's really important in supporting some type of projects, not a top-down project, but bottom-up projects created by these fishing organizations. Linha d'Água Institute is a really important organization in this process of small-scale fishers.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I know we are over 5 minutes, which is fine because, this is such interesting discussions that we cannot avoid sometimes. But I believe that these discussions continue beyond, this platform itself, So thank you very much, Deborah, for that interesting and very analytical, piece of talk. And we'll continue these discussions, but also huge thank yous to the people that joined through YouTube and asked interesting questions. And, I invite all of you to the next, edition of our V2V thematic webinar series, which is going to be on the last Friday, which is 27th of September. And we'll announce it, in the next 1 or 2 weeks. So see you there again. Thank you very much once again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.